The frost arrived early that December in St. Aldwyn on the Green, glazing every rooftop with a delicate shimmer that made the small village look as if it had been plucked from a Christmas card. Even the duck pond behind the vicarage had developed a thin sheet of ice, much to the children's delight and the ducks' obvious annoyance. Villagers bustled about with an air of cheerful urgency, preparing for the last social event of the season before the New Year festivities began, Lady Barton's annual winter gathering at Hawthorne Hall. Hawthorne Hall stood proudly at the edge of the village, a sprawling Georgian estate with ivy climbing stubbornly across its walls and windows that always looked faintly surprised. Inside, Lady Agatha Barton, widowed these past 10 years and eternally formidable, ensured every detail of the gathering was exactly as it had been for decades. The silver had been polished until it nearly blinded the eye. The punch was brewed according to an ancient family recipe involving too many spices to count, and every villager of importance had received an invitation written in Lady Barton's famously spiky handwriting. Among the guests, though certainly not given much thought by most, was Miss Jane Marple, who had come to St. Aldwyn for a fortnight's stay with her old friend, Mrs. Lavinia Littleford. Miss Marple, bundled in a soft grey shawl and clutching a small handbag, looked perfectly at home among the polished banisters and garlanded doorways. She had, as always, a faintly amused expression, as though human behaviour, however festive, never failed to entertain her. As the gathering unfurled like a grand tapestry, conversations blossomed throughout the hall. Colonel Thirlwell loudly debated the local council budget with terrible enthusiasm. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, was whispering urgently to anyone who would listen about a missing parcel that was not merely suspicious, but downright sinister. The young Timothy Barton, Lady Barton's great-nephew, stood sullenly near the fireplace, staring into the flames with a brooding intensity that only a young man of 21 who believed himself misunderstood could possess. The air buzzed with gossip, holiday cheer, and a certain unmistakable undercurrent of something unspoken, something slightly off. Miss Marple noticed it immediately, the way one might notice a slightly wilted sprig in an otherwise perfect wreath. Her pale blue eyes, though half hidden beneath her knitted hat, missed nothing. She observed that Lady Barton seemed especially tense this evening, fussing endlessly with the positioning of ornaments or drifting abruptly into silence whenever someone addressed her directly. She also noticed that several guests glanced toward the staircase with discomfort, as if expecting someone unwelcome to appear. But the moment that truly caught Miss Marple's attention occurred not at the buffet table nor near the roaring fire, but in the small, dimly lit conservatory where she stepped, briefly to admire Lady Barton's prized white camellias. The scent of damp earth and winter air clung to the place, making it delightfully peaceful, until it wasn't. A sudden, sharp cry echoed from the hallway beyond. It was short, cut off abruptly, but unmistakably full of shock. Miss Marple froze, her gloved hand hovering above a camellia bloom. She waited a beat, listening, then another. Silence. But not a natural one, not the pleasant hush of an English winter evening. No, this was a heavy, deliberate silence, a silence in which people were holding their breath. She stepped out into the corridor with her small, purposeful steps just in time to see Lady Barton herself, standing rigidly near the base of the stairs, one hand pressed to her throat. Guests were beginning to gather around her, murmuring anxiously. At the foot of the staircase, sprawled in a most unnatural position, lay Harold Pembroke, the village solicitor, a man known for his excellent memory, his meticulous accounting habits, and his fondness for sherry. He was now quite unmistakably dead. "Good heavens," Mrs. Finch whispered, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "Do you think he slipped?" Miss Marple's eyes dropped to the scene with quiet concentration. Harold Pembroke's glasses lay several feet away, as though flung rather than fallen. A dark bruise was already forming along his temple, and the stair carpet, thick, plush, meticulously maintained, was hardly the sort that encouraged accidents. "Possibly," Miss Marple answered softly. "But then again, people rarely cry out when they slip." Lady Barton swayed visibly, and Timothy rushed to her side. "Aunt Agatha, please sit. Someone fetch Dr. Felton." But Miss Marple observed that Lady Barton did not look merely shocked. She looked terrified. The guests whispered, some in horror, some in curiosity, all in confusion. And while many leaned toward the obvious explanation, an unfortunate fall on a festive evening, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the angle of the body, the missing glasses, the bruise, and a small scuff mark on the polished banister. Things, she thought calmly, were very rarely as simple as they seemed. And in St. Whodunit, the peaceful village preparing for the new year, this was only the beginning. Miss Marple remained near the staircase longer than most, her eyes tracing the details others were too distressed or too eager to speculate to notice. While the guests buzzed around Lady Barton and poor Harold's still form, she quietly stepped closer, ensuring she did not disturb anything, and studied the banister. It was polished to a mirror-like sheen, yet halfway down, just above the fourth step, a faint, irregular scuff had disrupted the gloss. Not the broad smear of a falling hand, more like the sharp scrape of something metallic or the edge of a shoe forced hard against the wood. A struggle, perhaps, brief but decisive. Miss Marple did not touch the mark. She only nodded slightly to herself, as though confirming something half-formed in her mind. Dr. Felton arrived soon after, breathless and carrying his medical bag in a way that suggested he had been roused from a particularly comfortable after-dinner nap. "Stand aside, please," he barked, though not unkindly, and knelt beside the body. Lady Barton looked away quickly, but Miss Marple observed that her hand remained tightly clamped on her lace handkerchief, as though she feared it might float away if she let go. Timothy hovered beside her, pale but determined. "It must have been an accident," Timothy said loudly, perhaps not for the doctor's benefit, but for his aunt's. "Uncle Harold, well, he always complained about his eyesight at night. And these stairs, they have carried many feet safely," Lady Barton whispered, her voice trembling. "Many, many years." Miss Marple noticed the odd phrasing, the strange emphasis. There was a depth to Lady Barton's fear that went far beyond the shock of an unexpected death at her party. It was the kind of fear one had when something one had hoped never to confront had finally caught up. Dr. Felton exhaled slowly. "He's gone, likely a head injury, though whether the fall caused it," his voice drifted into uncertainty, and Miss Marple saw his eyes flick to the same bruise she had noted, the one too sharp, too localized to match an accidental tumble. Before the doctor could continue, the front door burst open, letting in a gust of icy wind and Detective Inspector Rowan, broad-shouldered, brisk, and determined to appear more confident than he sometimes felt. He tipped his hat to Lady Barton, his expression softening slightly. "Terribly sorry for the circumstances, ma'am. We'll get things sorted." His gaze swept the staircase, the body, the crowd. "Right. I'll need everyone to remain here at the hall until we've gathered statements. Purely routine." He added the last part quickly, aware of how villagers reacted to anything that suggested suspicion. Colonel Thirlwell harumphed loudly. "Never thought I'd see such a tragedy at Hawthorne Hall. Dreadful business. Dreadful." The inspector ignored him in favor of approaching Miss Marple. "I see you found your way to the front of things, Miss Marple." Her smile was pleasant, almost apologetic. "I'm afraid I was simply in the conservatory when the poor man fell. Quite impossible not to hear it." Rowan gave her a skeptical look. He had crossed paths with Miss Marple before and knew perfectly well that she rarely happened to be anywhere without silently cataloguing every poor detail. "Well, if you noticed anything unusual, you'll let us know." "Oh," Miss Marple said gently. "I imagine you'll be far too busy for my little observations. Better you focus on more concrete matters." The inspector frowned. Miss Marple's humility, he knew, usually meant she had already spotted something he had not. He opened his notebook. "Lady Barton, could you tell me—" But before he could begin, a sudden commotion arose from the far end of the hall. Mrs. Finch, the post-mistress, was clutching her handbag and looking wildly about. "My parcel!" she cried. "The one I thought went missing. It's gone entirely now. It was here when I arrived." Miss Marple turned her head sharply. A missing parcel was hardly comparable to a sudden death, but then again, seemingly trivial matters had a curious way of revealing larger truths. Lady Barton swayed again, pressing a shaking hand to her brow. "Inspector, if we might move away from the stairs. I cannot bear to look any longer." Rowan nodded and signaled for 2 constables to discreetly cover the body. But as they moved, Miss Marple noticed a brief, wordless exchange between Lady Barton and Timothy, tense, urgent, and filled with unspoken warning. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Something was being concealed. Something that connected Harold Pembroke to this house, to these stairs, and perhaps to the long shadow stretching quietly behind Lady Barton's composed façade. And as the guests settled uneasily into drawing rooms and hallways, whispering theories with growing eagerness, Miss Marple knew with calm certainty that the first layer of the mystery had only just been peeled back, and what lay beneath would not be pleasant. The guests were guided into the drawing room, a space usually reserved for polite laughter, quiet card games, and Lady Barton's prized collection of porcelain figurines. Tonight, however, the room felt stifling, heavy with unease. The fire crackled too loudly, as though it too sensed the tension drifting between the guests like fog. Lady Barton had been guided to a high-backed armchair, where she sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the carpet. Timothy Barton hovered protectively nearby, refusing to sit despite his aunt's attempts to dismiss him with soft, trembling words. Miss Marple settled discreetly near the corner, her knitting bag on her lap, though she made no attempt to remove anything from it. Observation, not knitting, occupied her hands this evening. Inspector Rowan moved toward the center of the room with a purposeful stride. "We'll take statements one at a time. Please remain calm. Mr. Pembroke's passing may well have been an unfortunate accident." He delivered the line with practiced firmness, though Miss Marple noticed the inspector's eyes narrow momentarily. He was unconvinced, though trying not to alarm the guests. Colonel Thirlwell puffed out his chest. "I say, no need to mollycoddle us, Rowan. A man doesn't land like that from a simple stumble, Mrs." Finch gasped loudly, clutching her missing handbag tightly against her chest. "Oh, Colonel, must you speak so bluntly? Poor Mr. Pembroke. And to think I lost my parcel on the very same night. There must be villains about." Timothy rolled his eyes, though subtly. Miss Marple caught it nonetheless. Miss Finch's theories were often dramatic, but tonight there could be a thread of truth woven through her panic. Rowan rubbed the bridge of his nose and motioned for quiet. "Mrs. Finch will address your parcel shortly." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. "Mrs. Finch, dear, what was in your parcel?" The postmistress blinked in surprise, her cheeks flushing. "Why? Well, nothing precious, I assure you. Just a few documents I'd rather not have misplaced." "Important documents?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Finch hesitated, then spoke quickly. "Not at all. Nothing remotely to do with Mr. Pembroke, I'm sure." She looked away too swiftly, the tip of her ear turning red. Miss Marple made a mental note. People often lied fastest when they wanted to distance themselves from something. Meanwhile, Inspector Rowan began his interviews, starting with Colonel Thirlwell, whose booming voice filled the entire room. "Saw him going upstairs near 8 o'clock. Looked perfectly fine then. Didn't seem in any hurry. Always had a measured sort of way about him." Lady Barton's head snapped up at that, her eyes widening for the briefest moment before she forced her expression smooth once more. Miss Marple saw it and stored the reaction carefully. Timothy added reluctantly, "He went up to speak with Aunt Agatha, didn't he? You said he had a matter to discuss." Lady Barton's voice was faint. "A small matter, hardly worth mentioning," but Miss Marple heard the crack in the façade, the unmistakable quiver of someone hiding something under layers of polite restraint. Felton cleared his throat from a nearby sofa. "Harold wasn't in the best of health lately. Stress, I told him. Too much work at the office." "But he was here socially, Mrs." Finch said. "Why would a man come to a party if he was under dreadful strain?" Timothy's lips tightened. Because Lady Barton insisted he attend, but he glanced at his aunt again, his voice dipping. "Didn't you?" A silence settled heavily, thick enough to draw every gaze toward Lady Barton. She folded her hands in her lap. "Mr. Pembroke was a dear friend of the family. It was only proper to have him join us." Yet her voice failed to disguise the sorrow and fear beneath. Miss Marple's attention drifted then to the doorway, where she caught a glimpse of one of the constables quietly conferring with Inspector Rowan. Rowan listened, stiffened slightly, then excused himself and left the room with the constable at his side. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Something had been found. But before she could ponder what it might be, a sudden clatter echoed from upstairs, something falling, perhaps a door shut too quickly. Every head turned toward the staircase. Lady Barton closed her eyes, her fingers digging into her handkerchief. Rowan re-entered moments later, his expression unreadable. "I'll need to see Lady Barton privately," he said. Timothy stepped forward instantly. "Anything you need to say to her can be said in front of me." "No," Lady Barton whispered, rising slowly. "It's quite all right, Timothy." But Miss Marple, watching her carefully, noted the near-frantic fear in the young man's eyes. A fear not for himself, but for his aunt. As Lady Barton and Inspector Rowan exited the drawing room, the guests erupted in whispers. Mrs. Finch leaned toward Miss Marple. "You don't think she had anything to do with it, do you?" "Oh, but she did look pale when Harold's name was mentioned earlier." Miss Marple smiled softly. When one sees something they hoped would remain hidden come to light, it can unsettle the nerves far more than tragedy alone. Mrs. Finch blinked. "Meaning?" "Oh," Miss Marple said lightly, "only that secrets, like parcels, have a tendency to go missing at the most inconvenient times." Her knitting bag remained unopened, but her mind was stitching together threads with quiet certainty. Something tied Harold Pembroke to Lady Barton. Something unpleasant. And Miss Marple suspected that what the constable had found upstairs was about to make the next layer of the mystery unfold rather neatly indeed. Miss Marple remained in her corner, quietly observing as the guests tried, and largely failed, to resume a semblance of normality. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls, and the air smelled faintly of burnt wood and citrus from the evening's neglected punch bowl. Each whispered comment, each nervous glance, fed her growing sense that this was far more than a simple accident. After a tense interval, Inspector Rowan returned alone. He gestured for Miss Marple to join him in the hallway, where the low light lent a hushed gravity to his words. "Miss Marple, I've had a chance to look upstairs," he said, his voice tight. "Nothing overtly suspicious, except a small desk drawer left open in Mr. Pembroke's usual room. Certain papers were removed. It's minor, perhaps, but I thought you might like to know." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Oh? And did the constables note if anything else was disturbed?" "They reported nothing else," he replied, "though the drawer had clearly been rifled. Whoever did it was in a hurry. I'm inclined to think it's unrelated to the fall, but it's curious nonetheless." Miss Marple made a mental note. Harold Pembroke had been on his way to discuss something with Lady Barton. Timothy had said so. If important papers were missing and a man died the same night, perhaps the two matters were more than coincidental. She turned her gaze toward the drawing room, where the guests' murmurs had grown louder, almost theatrical in their curiosity. Returning to the room, she noticed that Mrs. Finch had taken it upon herself to investigate the scene of the missing parcel. She bent over Lady Barton's writing desk, rifling through papers with the delicate precision of someone convinced that the world's secrets lay in file folders. Miss Marple's lips curved ever so slightly. Mrs. Finch's zeal often revealed more about herself than the mysteries she sought to solve. Timothy observed the scene, arms folded, his expression dark. "Mother wouldn't approve of this," he muttered under his breath, as if the adults had suddenly reverted to childlike rebellion. His words were directed toward no one, but Miss Marple caught the careful, suppressed anxiety behind them. He knew more than he let on. The conversation shifted as Dr. Felton entered with a cup of hot tea for Lady Barton. "You must rest, ma'am. The shock can be more damaging than the frost outside." His voice carried gentle authority, yet there was an edge of caution. He, too, sensed the odd undercurrent. Lady Barton accepted the tea with trembling hands, glancing toward Timothy. "It was sudden, so very sudden," she whispered, though her words seemed chosen as much to reassure herself as anyone else. Miss Marple observed the brief contact between the two, a subtle exchange, nearly invisible. Timothy's hand brushing the edge of hers for a heartbeat, a signal of solidarity or warning. Then he withdrew, as though to remind himself he must appear detached. Miss Marple filed the detail away, the kind of detail that would matter when the rest of the puzzle became clearer. The inspector returned briefly, calling for everyone's attention. "We will need to verify the time of Mr. Pembroke's arrival and who he spoke with just prior to the incident. Please, everyone, cooperate. It's routine but essential." Colonel Thirlwell, clearly attempting to maintain a sense of dignity, puffed up and muttered, "I suppose we all must recount our movements as if in some tedious rehearsal." Mrs. Finch whispered darkly about rehearsals for mischief, which drew a few nervous smiles, but no one dared respond too sharply. Miss Marple, however, noticed a new detail, the careful placement of small ornaments along the hallway table. One of the silver napkin rings was slightly askew, and the reflection of the gaslight revealed a faint smudge not matching the others. It was insignificant, perhaps, but in a house like Hawthorne Hall, even small anomalies rarely occurred by chance. As the evening wore on, murmurs shifted from speculation about a fall to conjecture about motive. Whispers hinted at disputes over property, debts unpaid, and old grievances with Harold Pembroke's precise yet sometimes overbearing manner. Miss Marple smiled gently to herself. The villagers' imaginations often supplied what evidence could not, revealing character more than fact. Yet despite the bustle, the subdued fear, and the whispered accusations, Miss Marple's attention remained anchored to one thing: the connection between the open drawer, the missing papers, and the subtle exchanges she had noted among the Barton family. Something vital was hidden in plain sight, and when the right moment came, she would be ready to see the invisible threads unravel. She sipped her tea, knitting bag still unopened, and allowed her gaze to drift once more across the assembled guests. In the flickering shadows, beneath the veneer of civility, lay secrets that would not remain buried. And in St. Aldwyn on the Green, secrets, as Miss Marple knew well, had a curious way of surfacing at the most inconvenient and sometimes deadly moments. Miss Marple watched as the guests gradually settled, though the tension hung thickly in the room like a stubborn winter fog. Colonel Thirlwell was still muttering about the impropriety of discussing a man's death so openly, while Mrs. Finch hovered near the hearth, casting anxious glances toward the staircase as though expecting Harold Pembroke to appear at any moment. Timothy sat silently beside his aunt, his hands clenched in his lap, eyes occasionally flicking toward the doorway as though anticipating some intruder. The inspector, having returned from another brief conference with the constables, approached Lady Barton with measured steps. "Ma'am, I need a list of all who arrived after 8 o'clock, he said. "It's standard procedure, but I insist we account for everyone." Lady Barton's eyes widened faintly, and she gave a slight nod. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation in her movements, the minuscule tremor in her hand as she reached for her tea. A small, nervous gesture, but telling. People seldom trembled without cause, particularly those accustomed to controlling every detail of a household and its visitors. As the inspector gathered names, Dr. Felton leaned toward Miss Marple. "Curious, isn't it?" he murmured. "A man falls, apparently an accident, and yet nothing quite adds up. Even Lady Barton seems uneasy beyond reason." "Unease often has roots deeper than the present," Miss Marple replied softly. "And tonight, I suspect, roots run quite deep indeed." A sudden stir from the window drew her gaze. Through the frost-patterned glass, the figure of a man trudged along the garden path, bundled in a heavy coat, his hat low over his eyes. The doorbell rang sharply, startling the group. Lady Barton rose, and Timothy hurried to assist her. The new arrival was Mr. Philip Draycott, a solicitor from a neighboring village and an old colleague of Harold Pembroke. He entered with a brisk nod to the inspector, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. "I was informed of the accident," he said, voice steady though tight. "I trust everyone is accounted for?" Miss Marple observed the man carefully. He seemed calm, professional, yet she detected a flicker of tension, an almost imperceptible hesitation, when he looked toward the staircase. Clearly, he knew more about the household than he revealed. "Indeed," Rowan replied. "We're collecting statements now. You're welcome to assist, Mr. Draycott." The solicitor's gaze shifted to Lady Barton, resting there just long enough for the corner of Miss Marple's eye to catch a subtle twitch. A quick tightening of the jaw, a fractionally raised brow. Small gestures, but they spoke volumes to a patient observer. Miss Marple returned her attention to the guests. Murmurs had shifted from speculation about the fall to suspicion about Mr. Pembroke's affairs. Mrs. Finch, clutching the empty parcel, whispered urgently to anyone who would listen about debts, disputes, and old grudges. Colonel Thirlwell attempted to dominate the conversation with loud assurances that no one had any motive for wrongdoing, though his voice wavered more than he intended. Timothy, despite his usual reticence, spoke quietly to Miss Marple. "Do you really think my aunt could have had any reason?" His words trailed off, uncertainty evident. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "A motive is often not what it first seems. The apparent reason may hide something quite different, but there is certainly something your aunt knows, or suspects, that others do not." The room's tension deepened when the inspector announced he wished to see all those who had been near the staircase that evening. One by one, the guests were questioned, their movements scrutinized, their recollections probed. Yet despite careful questioning, no clear answer emerged. The fall, the papers, the missing parcel, all remained puzzlingly disjointed. It was then that Miss Marple noticed another detail. A faint smudge of dust on the top edge of the banister near the fourth step. Someone had run a hand over it recently. Perhaps it was Harold himself, or perhaps it was someone who did not wish to be seen. Either way, it suggested premeditation rather than accident. By the time the inspector had finished, the room was silent, save for the occasional whispered conjecture. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting bag untouched, and let her mind review the evening's events. The fall, the papers, Lady Barton's nervous gestures, Timothy's protective stance, Mrs. Finch's dramatic interruptions, and Mr. Draycott's subtle hesitation. Each detail alone seemed minor, almost insignificant. Yet, as always, Miss Marple knew that the whole picture would soon reveal a pattern, and that pattern, when seen clearly, would point to something far darker than anyone yet imagined. Miss Marple remained quietly in her corner as the evening wore on, her eyes drifting over the assembled guests with the calm patience of one accustomed to observing without being observed. The room had settled into a tense hush, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of skirts or the nervous cough of a colonel attempting to appear undisturbed. Lady Barton sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the fire, though the briefest flicker betrayed her unease whenever anyone spoke of Harold Pembroke. Timothy remained at her side, vigilant and alert, as if protecting his aunt from an unseen threat. Felton moved discreetly among the guests, offering tea and soothing words, though even his practiced composure could not mask the underlying tension. Miss Marple noticed that several guests, despite outwardly maintaining polite conversation, frequently cast furtive glances toward the staircase, as if fearing the return of the dead man or the sudden appearance of some hidden witness. It was an air of apprehension that spoke more than any statement, and Miss Marple absorbed it with quiet satisfaction, knowing that such subtleties often revealed more than words could convey. Inspector Rowan, having completed his initial questioning of the guests, took a moment to consult with one of the constables near the window. Their hushed conversation seemed to revolve around the upstairs rooms, and the constable occasionally glanced nervously toward the drawing room. Miss Marple, observing from her vantage point, noted a flicker of anxiety in the inspector's posture, an acknowledgement that this case, despite appearances, was proving to be less straightforward than a simple accident. Just then, the door opened abruptly, admitting a late arrival. The new guest, Mrs. Dorothea Whitby, a widow with a reputation for sharp wit and sharper observation, stepped inside with a polite nod to Lady Barton. She had clearly been summoned urgently, though her manner suggested she intended to take in the entire scene before committing herself to any words. Her eyes swept over the room, pausing briefly on the spot where Harold Pembroke had fallen, and Miss Marple caught the faint tightening of her lips. The woman's arrival introduced yet another variable into the unfolding puzzle, and Miss Marple made a mental note to observe her closely. The inspector cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. "Since we have several new arrivals and some irregularities to consider, I must insist that everyone remain for a few more minutes. We are simply gathering information to understand exactly what happened." His tone was firm, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Miss Marple's attention returned to the Barton family. She noticed that Timothy, though outwardly composed, had been shifting slightly in his chair, his gaze frequently darting toward the hallway as though expecting someone, or something, to emerge. Lady Barton's hands twitched in response to his movements, as if their nervous connection was communicated silently, beyond the need for words. It was a subtle interplay that Miss Marple filed away for later consideration. Meanwhile, Mrs. Finch, having exhausted her curiosity about the missing parcel, had begun to speculate loudly about Harold Pembroke's professional dealings. She whispered of disagreements over land, uncollected debts, and old grievances, ensuring that everyone within earshot could hear. Miss Marple noted, with quiet amusement, that the woman's imagination often embellished reality, yet it occasionally revealed truths about those around her that would otherwise remain hidden. A sudden knock at the door caused a momentary pause, and Inspector Rowan moved to answer it. Another constable entered, carrying a small envelope addressed in Mr. Pembroke's handwriting. The inspector's eyebrows rose as he broke the seal and examined its contents. Miss Marple, observing from her seat, could see the subtle signs of recognition in Lady Barton's eyes, followed by a barely perceptible glance toward Timothy. The envelope, Miss Marple deduced, contained something significant. Perhaps it explained the urgency of Harold Pembroke's visit. Perhaps it revealed a secret some hoped would remain buried. Whatever it contained, its existence added yet another thread to the growing web of intrigue. As the evening progressed, the room seemed to shrink under the weight of secrets, suspicions, and subtle tensions. Miss Marple sat back, knitting bag untouched, absorbing the atmosphere, cataloguing the expressions, gestures, and whispered exchanges. Each detail was a piece of the larger puzzle, and she felt the faint thrill of anticipation that always accompanied the early stages of a mystery in song. Whodunit on the Green, a seemingly peaceful village, the evening had taken on an undercurrent of danger. Miss Marple, calm and composed as ever, knew that this was only the beginning, and that the true nature of the night's events would soon begin to emerge in ways even the cleverest of villagers could not yet foresee. The envelope in Inspector Rowan's hand drew a hush over the room, the crackle of the fire suddenly seeming too loud in the silence. Lady Barton's eyes were fixed on it, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and Timothy shifted closer, protective instinct etched across his features. Miss Marple observed them both with quiet attention, noting the subtle, almost imperceptible exchange of glances, a silent conversation that conveyed more than words ever could. Inspector Rowan opened the envelope carefully, extracting a single sheet of paper. His brow furrowed as he read, and he glanced up at the assembled guests. It appears Mr. Pembroke had intended to speak with Lady Barton regarding a matter of urgency. The note indicates that some documents, of significance to this household, were in jeopardy. A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Finch gasped, clutching her missing parcel again as if it had suddenly gained a new importance. Colonel Thirlwell coughed, attempting to disguise his interest, though his eyes were sharp and calculating. Timothy leaned forward, his jaw tight, but said nothing. Lady Barton, however, remained seated, her expression carefully neutral, though Miss Marple could detect the faint tremor of tension in her hands. Felton stepped closer to the inspector. Documents in jeopardy. Do you mean something was stolen? Rowan nodded slowly. It would seem so. Someone either removed or attempted to remove papers from Mr. Pembroke's room prior to his visit tonight. The exact details remain unclear, but the implications are significant. Miss Marple, knitting bag untouched, allowed her gaze to wander. She observed the subtle shifts in posture, the flickers of discomfort on faces that tried to mask them. She noted Mrs. Dorothea Whitby's quiet attention, the ever-watchful eyes of Timothy, and the barely contained agitation in Lady Barton's demeanor. Each detail was a thread that might unravel the tapestry of the evening. As the inspector continued, a new voice broke through, a soft, precise voice belonging to none other than Mrs. Whitby. "May I see the note, Inspector?" she asked. She approached, her movements deliberate, her curiosity restrained by propriety. Rowan handed it over, and she studied it carefully, lips pursed as though weighing every word. Miss Marple noted the intensity with which Mrs. Whitby read the letter. Unlike the others, she did not react outwardly. There was no gasp, no shiver of surprise, only the careful absorption of information, a mind quietly cataloguing possibilities. Miss Marple found herself appreciating the woman's subtle acumen, though she also sensed that Mrs. Whitby's presence tonight was more than casual curiosity. Meanwhile, Timothy whispered to his aunt, "Aunt Agatha, should we tell him anything?" His voice was low, urgent and protective. Lady Barton shook her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "No, Timothy. Let him gather what he may. The truth will surface soon enough." Miss Marple's attention shifted to the rest of the guests. Even those who claimed no interest in Mr. Pembroke's affairs were reacting to the revelation in small, telling ways, shifting in chairs, adjusting collars, clearing throats. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, revealed itself far more clearly in moments of uncertainty than in the most ordinary of conversations. The inspector folded the note and turned to Lady Barton. "Ma'am, we may need to see these documents if you have them." Lady Barton's eyes flickered, and she rose slowly. Timothy followed her like a shadow, ever vigilant. "They are secure," she said in a calm voice that masked her inward tremor. "We will see that they are made available, but only after the proper arrangements are made." Miss Marple, knitting needles poised but still inactive, observed the careful choreography. Every movement, every glance, every half-word carried meaning. She had learned long ago that in matters of human deceit, the smallest gestures often betrayed the largest secrets. As the evening deepened, the room seemed to shrink beneath the weight of suspense. The missing documents, the mysterious note, Harold Pembroke's sudden death, each detail layered upon the others, forming a complex pattern that only a patient observer might begin to discern. Miss Marple knew as she sipped her tea quietly that the strands of the mystery were beginning to intertwine, and that sooner or later the true motive would reveal itself. And somewhere in the shadows of Hawthorne Hall, the presence of hidden intentions lingered, waiting for the right moment to surface as the peaceful village of St. Aldwyn on the Green teetered on the edge of revelation. The room had grown quieter now, each guest absorbed in their own thoughts, yet no one dared move too freely. Even the crackling fire seemed to acknowledge the tension, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Miss Marple, seated near the corner, allowed her gaze to drift thoughtfully across the assembly. Every face told a story. Every small movement hinted at an undercurrent not yet acknowledged aloud. Inspector Rowan, noting the lull, decided it was time to resume questioning, beginning with those who had been closest to the staircase. Colonel Thirlwell, whose composure had waned with the evening, recounted once again his observations. "I saw him ascend the stairs with apparent ease," he repeated, voice firm yet tinged with uncertainty. "Nothing seemed amiss until the cry, Mrs." Finch, clinging to her missing parcel like a talisman, leaned toward Miss Marple. "Do you think it could all be connected? The parcel, the papers, his death?" she whispered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, sometimes the most trivial matters are precisely the threads that unravel the greatest mysteries." Timothy Barton, still seated protectively beside his aunt, spoke softly. He came up to speak to Aunt Agatha, yes, but he also seemed concerned about something else. Something I didn't understand at the time. Lady Barton gave a subtle shake of her head, an almost imperceptible signal that she would not elaborate. Miss Marple's mind noted the hesitation. She had learned long ago that such silences often concealed more than the words themselves. Felton, observing the interactions, murmured to Rowan, "There is tension here beyond mere shock. Lady Barton's reactions are measured, yes, but there is a rigidity, an almost controlled fear." Rowan nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Indeed, something is being kept from us. Whether deliberately or subconsciously, that remains to be seen." At that moment, a faint tapping echoed from the library doorway. Miss Marple turned her head slightly and saw Mrs. Dorothea Whitby standing there, holding a small notebook. "If I may," she said, voice precise and measured. "I've taken the liberty of noting some inconsistencies. Perhaps they may prove useful." She glanced at Rowan, then at Lady Barton, before stepping into the room. Miss Marple's interest piqued. Mrs. Whitby's presence was always deliberate, her attention to detail meticulous. She observed the room as if cataloguing every gesture, every word, every unspoken glance. And yet, beneath the surface, Miss Marple suspected there was something else, a reason for her being here tonight beyond mere curiosity. The inspector allowed her to speak. "Go on, Mrs. Whitby." "There are minor details," Mrs. Whitby began, "that suggest the fall may not have been accidental. The positioning of objects, subtle disturbances, the timing of arrivals, all these small facts may form a pattern if observed collectively." Miss Marple nodded slightly. Indeed, she had noticed many of the same small facts. The scuff on the banister, the missing papers, the way Lady Barton's hand trembled when certain subjects were mentioned, Timothy's protective vigilance. And now, Mrs. Whitby had confirmed that at least one other observer had noted similar discrepancies. A sudden movement drew their attention to the staircase. A small object glinted under the low lamplight. Felton bent down and retrieved it. A cufflink engraved with the initials HP. It was tarnished slightly, suggesting it had fallen from a pocket in haste, perhaps during the struggle Miss Marple had suspected. "Interesting," Rowan murmured. "This was not noticed before?" Miss Marple shook her head softly. "Not everyone observes with care. Many see only what they expect to see." She rose and moved closer, examining the cufflink in her gloved hand. The tarnish was deliberate, or at least consistent with someone who had tried to remove it hastily. "Someone was here before the fall," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Someone who knew precisely where to touch, where to disturb, and what to leave unnoticed." The room was silent, each guest absorbing the implication. Miss Marple allowed. Brief pause, giving them space to consider the significance. Human nature, she knew, often betrayed itself in the smallest details, and tonight those details were beginning to align, revealing a hidden hand orchestrating events with care. As the evening pressed on, the sense of foreboding deepened. Miss Marple, calm and attentive, felt the invisible threads weaving together. The fall, the missing documents, the protective vigilance of Timothy, Lady Barton's unease, the curious presence of Mrs. Whitby, all pointed toward a design carefully concealed beneath the polished surface of Hawthorne Hall. And she knew that soon, the first crucial confrontation would bring some of these secrets to light. The room remained quiet for a moment after Miss Marple's observation, each guest weighing the implication of a deliberate act hidden among the appearance of accident. Lady Barton, though maintaining her composed posture, pressed her hand lightly to her forehead, as if warding off an unwelcome thought. Timothy remained alert at her side, his protective stance a silent statement that he would not leave her exposed to any harm, be it physical or otherwise. Inspector Rowan examined the cufflink carefully. "It fell from the pocket," he said, turning it over between his fingers. "But why leave it here? It seems almost as though someone wished to be noticed, yet not too obviously." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. A subtle message is often left in a way the unwary dismiss. People forget how keen the human eye can be when it chooses to notice. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Mrs. Dorothea Whitby, whose notebook lay open on a nearby table. The woman's fingers tapped lightly against it, the faintest rhythm that suggested she was mentally connecting dots the others had yet to see. Mrs. Finch, still clutching her empty handbag, whispered dramatically to no one in particular. "It's just like in the stories, isn't it? One clue, one seemingly trivial thing, and everything falls into place. Or does it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly but said nothing. Mrs. Finch's dramatic flair often clouded the truth, though occasionally it revealed more than she intended. Timothy finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "Inspector, if someone had a reason to harm Harold, it would have to involve, well, something he was carrying, wouldn't it? Or something he knew?" His eyes flicked to Lady Barton, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple observed the slight nod, noting how it mirrored a gesture she had seen earlier when Harold had been mentioned. A momentary recognition, quickly suppressed, a signal that knowledge, perhaps dangerous knowledge, lay in the past, waiting to surface. Inspector Rowan made a note in his pad. "Then we must ask, who had access to Mr. Pembroke tonight? Who could have intercepted him or his documents before he reached Lady Barton?" Miss Marple allowed herself a thoughtful pause. The guests were seated close enough to the staircase to have had opportunity, yet few would have had both motive and knowledge. Mrs. Whitby, for instance, had arrived late. Her observations, while useful, suggested she was not present during the critical moments. Timothy and Lady Barton were under no suspicion in that sense. Their protective behavior was transparent. It left others, the guests and household staff who had mingled earlier in the hall. Small inconsistencies had already been noted: the timing of arrivals, the minor disturbances of objects along the banister, the way Mrs. Finch's attention had been unusually focused on trivial matters. Each of these, Miss Marple realized, might contain a kernel of truth. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. It came from the direction of the library. Dr. Felton had gone to check the fireplace there and returned, holding a folded piece of paper. "Found this tucked behind some ledgers," he said, placing it gently on the table. Miss Marple picked it up with her gloved hand. The handwriting was familiar. Harold Pembroke's, though the contents were cryptic, a partial inventory of accounts and a note about urgent action before the new year. The room leaned forward as the inspector read over her shoulder. "Seems he was aware of something," he murmured. "Something pressing." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Indeed, and the urgency suggests he expected interference. This is why someone may have tried to meet him before he could deliver it to Lady Barton. The fall, the cufflink, even the missing drawer, they are pieces of a single design, executed with subtlety." Lady Barton's fingers trembled on the arm of her chair. Timothy leaned closer, murmuring something she did not respond to, though her eyes flickered toward the inspector briefly, as if weighing the choice of words. Miss Marple noted the calculated restraint. Secrets, she thought, were often most revealing when people tried hardest to hide them. The evening pressed on, the firelight flickering across anxious faces. Outside, frost glimmered faintly on the hedges of Hawthorne Hall, and the wind whispered through the trees like a faint echo of hidden movements. Miss Marple's knitting bag remained untouched, but her mind was alive with connections, each detail forming the framework of the mystery. Somewhere in the house, a secret waited to reveal itself, and she knew that the careful observation of tonight's events would soon expose a truth far more deliberate than any mere accident. The night deepened, and the guests' whispers became quieter, though a palpable tension lingered over Hawthorne Hall. Each face in the drawing room reflected a blend of curiosity, anxiety, and subtle calculation. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner, observed these details with the patience of someone who had learned that the smallest gestures often revealed the largest truths. Inspector Rowan had excused himself briefly, returning with a small bundle of documents retrieved from the missing drawer upstairs. "These were tucked beneath the lining of the desk," he explained. "It seems someone attempted to remove them but was interrupted. Fortunately, they were not taken entirely." He handed the papers to Lady Barton, who accepted them with careful composure, her fingers brushing the bundle as though to reassure herself that the documents were intact. Timothy leaned toward his aunt. "Are they important?" His voice was low, almost reverent. Lady Barton's lips pressed together before she replied. "They contain sensitive information regarding the estate, and matters Mr. Pembroke felt compelled to clarify before the new year." Miss Marple noted the phrasing. Matters he felt compelled to clarify. Such words often concealed more than they revealed. Harold Pembroke's urgency, the mysterious fall, and the interrupted documents all pointed toward a premeditated act, carried out by someone who knew precisely what they were seeking. Mrs. Whitby moved closer, her notebook in hand. "It strikes me," she said carefully, "that timing is everything. If the attempt to intercept these papers was deliberate, then the person responsible had to know both Mr. Pembroke's habits and the layout of this house." She paused, eyes scanning the room as though weighing each individual silently. Not everyone could have orchestrated such a precise interference. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the Lady Barton, noting the faintest flinch, the momentary tightening of her hands on the armchair. Timothy's protective posture beside her reinforced her earlier observation. The Bartons were deeply invested in what had transpired, but the precise knowledge required suggested someone with familiarity beyond that of a casual guest. "Dr. Felton, sensing the growing tension, murmured, "Then it must be someone within the household, or someone we might least suspect." His voice carried no accusation, only acknowledgement of a truth the room already suspected but had yet to articulate. A soft noise from the staircase interrupted the discussion, a step, deliberate and careful. All eyes turned. Mrs. Finch gasped and clutched her handbag closer. Inspector Rowan stepped forward, cautious but ready, while Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. From the shadows of the corridor emerged the housekeeper, Mrs. Withers, her face pale. "Inspector, I found something," she stammered, holding out a small, folded piece of paper. Her hands shook slightly. It was tucked behind the loose panel in the corridor wall near the top of the stairs. Rowan took the paper, unfolding it carefully. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room. The handwriting was firm, precise, and familiar. Harold Pembroke's. The note contained a list of names, including some from the drawing room, and a terse message. "All matters must be resolved before the new year. Trust is fragile." The implications hung in the air. Timothy's eyes widened slightly, and Lady Barton pressed her lips together, avoiding any direct gaze. Even Mrs. Whitby paused, her fingers holding the notebook still, her mind evidently racing. Miss Marple, knitting bag still unopened, allowed herself a faint smile. The pieces were aligning. The fall, the missing drawer, the cufflink, the interrupted papers, and now this secret note. All suggested more than coincidence. Someone had orchestrated events carefully, leaving just enough evidence to mislead casual observers. And yet, through human behavior, subtle gestures, and quiet observation, the truth was beginning to emerge. She looked across the room, her gaze settling on those whose gestures betrayed more than words. One of them, perhaps the most unsuspecting, was hiding knowledge of a plan that, if fully revealed, could explain Harold Pembroke's urgency, the attempted theft of documents, and the fatal accident that had stunned the household. Miss Marple knew it would take patience and subtle probing to draw the final reaction, but the moment of revelation was approaching. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows, carrying with it the cold edge of winter, while inside Hawthorne Hall, secrets waited to surface, and the first true confrontation of the evening was nearly at hand. The room had grown colder as the evening deepened, though the fire continued its relentless crackle, casting long, flickering shadows across the polished surfaces of Hawthorne Hall. Each guest seemed caught in a web of speculation, watching the others with cautious curiosity, as if the slightest movement might betray hidden truths. Miss Marple remained in her corner, knitting bag untouched, her sharp eyes quietly tracing every gesture, every glance, every breath of unease that passed between them. Inspector Rowan, sensing the tension, decided to confront the situation more directly. "Lady Barton," he began, his tone firm yet courteous, "it is evident that your household, or someone with knowledge of it, was involved in the disturbance that preceded Mr. Pembroke's accident. I must ask you, who else had access to his intended documents?" Lady Barton's fingers twitched for a brief moment before folding in her lap. "Only those whom I trust implicitly, Inspector, and of course, my nephew Timothy has always been close in matters of household concern." Her voice remained calm, but Miss Marple noticed the almost imperceptible quiver in her tone when she spoke the word trust. Timothy, sitting rigidly at her side, met the inspector's gaze evenly. It was Aunt Agatha's instruction that the papers be kept secure. "None of us touched them until the evening," he stated, though his eyes flickered briefly toward the staircase, betraying concern beyond propriety. Mrs. Whitby, still holding her notebook, interjected gently, "Inspector, may I point out the unusual timing? The fall, the disappearance of the documents, and the appearance of the cufflink all suggest that the person involved had intimate knowledge of the house and Mr. Pembroke's habits. It is unlikely to be a stranger." Miss Marple inclined her head ever so slightly. Indeed, she had noted the same detail, and the thought had long since settled in her mind. A stranger could not have orchestrated such precision without leaving more overt signs. The subtleties of human behavior, the protective instincts, the slight gestures of fear or concealment. They pointed to someone familiar. Inspector Rowan turned to the guests who had remained quieter throughout the evening. "It may be necessary to consider who among you had opportunity and motive. Subtle as it may be, human behavior rarely lies." His eyes swept across the room, pausing momentarily on Mrs. Finch, who clutched her empty handbag with a trembling hand. "Even minor actions," he continued, "can reveal intentions not otherwise stated." Mrs. Finch's gasp startled those nearby, and she muttered something about an unworthy thought before quickly averting her eyes. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the slip. Though dramatic and easily dismissed, it might indicate awareness of more than she outwardly admitted. Miss Marple, sensing the appropriate moment, spoke softly but with precision. "It is often the smallest of details that reveal the greatest truths," she said, allowing her gaze to settle briefly on Lady Barton. A finger too tense, a glance too fleeting, a hand too quick to conceal, these are the gestures that betray intentions hidden beneath calm exteriors. Lady Barton's eyes flicked toward her niece, then to Timothy, who shifted slightly but did not speak. Miss Marple's intuition, honed over decades of quiet observation, whispered that the threads of the mystery were close to being unraveled. She could sense the subtle tightening of the room's tension as the individuals who knew more than they admitted became aware of her quiet scrutiny. Inspector Rowan, noting Miss Marple's demeanor, asked, "Miss Marple, do you have insight to share?" She inclined her head lightly, as though weighing the words carefully. It is rarely a stranger who orchestrates events in a household so well known to them, and those who believe themselves discreet often reveal more through minor gestures than they ever intend. Observe their reactions carefully. The truth is seldom hidden from attentive eyes. A hush fell over the room. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows, a sharp reminder of the night's chill. Inside, Hawthorne Hall held its breath, as if waiting for the first of the concealed truths to be voiced aloud. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the one detail that had caught her attention earlier, the slight smudge on the banister, the subtle tremor in Lady Barton's hands. Timothy's protective posture, and she knew the confrontation that would expose the final truth was only moments away. The pieces, each small and almost imperceptible, were finally aligning, and Miss Marple's patience, like a careful needle in her knitting, would soon draw the invisible threads together to reveal the design that had brought tragedy into the household. The evening had taken on a charged stillness, the sort that settles over a room when every eye is watching, every ear straining for the smallest hint of revelation. Miss Marple, seated near the corner, let her gaze roam with quiet precision, noting the almost imperceptible tension in each guest. Lady Barton's hands remained clasped tightly in her lap, but Miss Marple could see the minute tremor in her fingertips. Timothy sat close by, shoulders squared and eyes alert, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble, while Mrs. Finch shifted nervously, muttering to herself about hidden motives as she glanced around. Inspector Rowan, sensing the critical moment, addressed the room. "I believe it is time to understand exactly what happened this evening. There is more to Mr. Pembroke's fall than mere misfortune. The documents, the cufflink, even the note recently found, these point to deliberate action." His eyes swept across the guests, lingering on each in turn. "It is essential we uncover who was involved, directly or indirectly." A faint hush settled over the room. Miss Marple allowed a brief pause, giving space for the tension to manifest. She had long known that the first reaction when secrets are probed often revealed more than words. She noted the subtle shifts, the flick of an eye, the tightening of a jaw, a quick swallow, all signs that someone carried more knowledge than they admitted. Mrs. Whitby, still holding her notebook, spoke quietly but firmly. "Inspector, the movements of the evening indicate someone familiar with both Mr. Pembroke and this household acted with intent. The timing of the fall, the missing documents, and the placement of objects suggest planning rather than accident." Miss Marple nodded slightly. Indeed, she had observed the same details. The scuff on the banister, the displaced ornament, the faint trace of a hand's passage across the desk drawer. Each small act was deliberate, designed to mislead and yet expose if one knew where to look. Timothy leaned toward his aunt, whispering something Miss Marple could not hear, though the subtle nod from Lady Barton suggested agreement. Miss Marple's eyes caught a fleeting glance exchanged between them, a silent communication born of urgency and unspoken concern. Protective instincts, she knew, often revealed what the mind sought to conceal. Inspector Rowan turned back to the group. "We must consider opportunity, motive, and access. Who had the chance to intercept Mr. Pembroke, who knew of the documents, and who might have acted to ensure they were delayed or misplaced?" Miss Marple observed the reactions carefully. Mrs. Finch's face had gone pale, her lips moving silently as if rehearsing an excuse or a tale. Colonel Thirlwell adjusted his position, eyes darting toward the staircase as though considering escape or justification. Lady Barton's composure, though outwardly intact, betrayed a shadow of worry in the tilt of her head and the tightening of her shoulders. Then, with deliberate calm, Miss Marple spoke. "It is often not the most visible, nor the most vocal, who bears the answer. Small, almost imperceptible details, the way one hesitates, the care with which objects are handled, gestures meant to appear casual, these betray the truth to one who watches closely." Her eyes rested on Lady Barton for a heartbeat, then shifted to Timothy, then briefly to the other guests. "Someone acted tonight, and the evidence has been laid before us in subtle ways. The task is to recognize the pattern." A whisper ran through the room. Inspector Rowan paused, then nodded slowly. "Yes, and I believe, with careful questioning and observation, we may soon see who had both motive and means." Miss Marple, knitting bag still untouched, felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The web of the evening, documents, fall, cufflink, note, subtle gestures, protective movements, was beginning to form a coherent pattern. And in that pattern lay the key to exposing not only the sequence of events, but the hand that had orchestrated them. Outside, the wind rattled the windows of Hawthorne Hall as if urging secrets to surface, while inside, the guests sat poised on the edge of revelation. Miss Marple's calm eyes took in every detail, every expression, every subtle movement. Soon the truth would emerge, not through force, but through observation, patience, and the undeniable transparency of human nature. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, her knitting bag finally abandoned at her side. The room, previously tense and restless, seemed to lean forward with collective anticipation, sensing that the quiet observer was about to speak. Inspector Rowan gave her an encouraging nod, though his eyes betrayed his curiosity as to what she had deduced. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began, her voice soft yet deliberate, "we have been discussing what seems, on the surface, a tragic accident. But accidents rarely occur in isolation when subtle patterns suggest deliberate action. And patterns, as I have learned, are easiest to discern when one pays attention to the small, often overlooked details of human behavior. She paused, letting her words settle. Her gaze rested first on Lady Barton. The nervousness I observed tonight, the hesitation when certain topics were mentioned, and the protective behavior of Timothy, all these are natural reactions to a distressing event. Yet there is another element, the faint smudge on the banister, the missing documents and the cufflink that points toward deliberate interference before Mr. T. Pembroke's fall. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, each beginning to feel the invisible threads tightening. Miss Marple continued. Now consider opportunity and knowledge. Whoever acted must have known the layout of the house intimately and understood Mr. Pembroke's habits. They also needed access to the documents he carried and the foresight to anticipate when he would traverse the staircase. Timothy's brow furrowed, his protective instinct flaring, while Mrs. Finch muttered something about a devilish plan, though her voice was tremulous. Miss Marple's eyes shifted slightly, catching a flicker of surprise in Mrs. Dorothea Whitby's expression, but it passed almost immediately. The key, Miss Marple said gently, lies in human nature itself. Those who try hardest to conceal their knowledge often betray it through the smallest gestures, the fleeting glance, the involuntary twitch, the hesitation in a word. Her gaze finally settled firmly on one figure in the room. Lady Barton. It was you, Lady Barton. A faint gasp rose, and Timothy rose abruptly, as if to defend his aunt. Miss Marple held up a hand. Do not interrupt. Observe first, and you will understand. Lady Barton's eyes widened, her composure momentarily fractured, and Miss Marple pressed on. You knew of Mr. Pembroke's concerns regarding the estate and the sensitive documents he carried. You feared that disclosure might compromise certain plans or reveal truths long buried. So you intercepted the papers, intending to delay their delivery. When Mr. Pembroke resisted, there was a struggle near the staircase. The cufflink fell from his pocket during the altercation, and in a moment of misjudged force or panic, he tumbled down the steps. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the quiet gasp of realization. Timothy's face shifted from shock to anger, while Lady Barton's hands trembled visibly. You see, Miss Marple continued, the evidence was subtle but telling. The misplaced documents, the smudge on the banister, the hurried movements upstairs, and, of course, the protective vigilance of those around you, which spoke to what was concealed, and the note tucked behind the ledgers. It was left by Harold Pembroke, expecting interference. It contained the instructions that made your fear of disclosure so acute. Lady Barton finally spoke, her voice breaking. I only wanted to protect the family, to prevent scandal. She trailed off, unable to finish. Inspector Rowan stepped forward gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Your intentions may have been protective, but actions have consequences, Lady Barton. The evidence is clear, thanks to Miss Marple's careful observations. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes softening. It is always human nature, rather than brute force, that tells the truth. One does not need science or clever tricks, only careful observation, patience, and the recognition that the smallest gestures often speak louder than words. Timothy sank back into his chair, silent but contemplative, while the other guests absorbed the revelation with a mixture of shock, relief, and grudging respect for Miss Marple's quiet brilliance. Mrs. Whitby made a discreet note in her book, her earlier curiosity now tempered by admiration. Even Mrs. Finch, after a dramatic sigh, murmured, Well, I never thought. Remarkable indeed. Outside, the wind continued its whisper through the hedges. But inside Hawthorne Hall, the storm of suspicion had subsided. Miss Marple returned to her chair, finally picking up her knitting. She glanced at the assembled company, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. And now, she said softly, we may all breathe a little easier. having seen that even the darkest intentions cannot escape the careful eye of observation. The house, though touched by tragedy, settled back into its measured rhythm and life in St. Aldwyn on the Green would continue, with the reassuring knowledge that human nature, however flawed, could be understood and gently unraveled by those who watched with patience, wisdom, and kindness.